The chandelier light shimmered above the table, throwing sharp glints across crystal glasses and polished silver. Conversation flowed easily, laughter threaded with champagne bubbles, until his voice cut through the air. A single sentence, cruelly precise, reduced her to silence. The sting of humiliation was immediate, felt like fire spreading through her chest, yet she kept her composure. His words had been meant to crush, to remind her she didn't belong among the glittering crowd. But what he didn't see, what no one saw, was that she wasn't broken. She was calculating. Subscribe to our channel. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no warmth. Every nerve in her body screamed to lash out, to answer insult with venom, but she didn't. Fury coiled inside her, carefully hidden behind a mask of grace. He thought her silence was submission. He mistook restraint for weakness. If he had looked closely, he would have noticed her eyes, steady and unblinking, carrying the storm that was already beginning to form. Around her, the crowd fed on the spectacle. Some smirked openly, their glances dripping with contempt. Others tried and failed to disguise their unease, their nervous chuckles betraying them. She sat still, listening to the laughter build around her humiliation. The betrayal wasn't just his words. It was the complicity of everyone who watched and chose not to stand by her. Their silence added fuel to a fire that would not die easily. A seed had been planted, watered by their scorn, and it was already taking root. She let her eyes linger on him a moment longer, memorizing the smug tilt of his head, the way arrogance softened his features into carelessness. In that instant, she made a promise to herself, one that required no words. This insult, this public tearing of her pride, would not be forgotten. She would bide her time, sharpen her resolve, and when the moment came, the cost would be everything he held dear, and time, as it always does, began to reveal his cracks. With each victory he imagined he had won, his pride grew heavier, his steps less careful. He believed himself untouchable, the king of his domain, adored by those around him. But his arrogance was not strength. It was weakness masquerading as power. While he reveled in his illusion, she watched, patient and precise, as the first fractures in his empire began to show. Behind her calm exterior, she became the perfect observer. Every careless boast, every whispered rumor, every careless debt or hidden indiscretion, she gathered them all like threads in a tapestry. What others dismissed as harmless flaws, she recorded with the cold precision of a strategist. He lived, loudly, never imagining that someone could be listening this closely, and the more he flaunted, the easier it became for her to pull his secrets into focus. The trap began to weave itself, though he believed himself far from danger. His laughter grew sharper, his arrogance more careless, as if daring fate itself. What he never realized was that every step he took brought him closer to the snare. She had built it patiently, strand by strand, with his own ego as the bait. Soon, it would be too perfect, too precise, for him to ever escape. When the moment came, it was subtle at first. A shift in conversation, a silence that lingered too long, a glance that revealed more than it should. His dominance slipped, and, for the first time, he felt the unsettling sting of being watched. She struck not with fury, but with precision. What had once been his laughter curdled into confusion, then desperation, as he realized the balance of power had shifted. He was no longer the predator, he was prey, and then came the unmasking. The banquet hall that once echoed with her humiliation now became the stage for his downfall. Secrets he thought buried spilled like broken glass across the table, cutting into the image he had crafted. Gasps replaced laughter, eyes widened in disbelief, and the same public gaze he had once weaponized against her turned mercilessly against him. He was stripped bare, every deception revealed, every false victory undone. There was no escape, no mercy left for him. His empire of pride crumbled in the very place where he had once sought to destroy her dignity. Too late, he understood the gravity of his mistake, that the insult which had begun as a careless cruelty was the very stone that pulled him into ruin. She never needed to raise her voice or declare her triumph. His downfall was written in his own arrogance. She rose from the table with quiet authority, untouched by the chaos she had unleashed. There was no need for gloating. Her silence was crown enough. Every eye followed her, not with contempt, but with a reluctant acknowledgement of her power. She had proven that dignity, patience, and intelligence were sharper weapons than any insult could ever be. Success was her revenge, and she wore it like armor, and so she left it all behind: the chandeliers, the laughter, the poisoned gazes of those who had once turned against her. The past no longer chained her, nor did his name carry any weight in her life. With every step forward, she walked into a future defined not by betrayal, but by the strength she had claimed for herself. He was erased, undone by his own arrogance, while she carried only dignity into the dawn that awaited her. Silk draped across the ballroom walls, catching the light of chandeliers that seemed too heavy to hold their brilliance. Laughter rose and fell in delicate waves, polished shoes clicking against marble as guests floated through rehearsed courtesies. Yet beneath the surface shimmer, there were divisions sharper than the cut of crystal glass. Glances whispered louder than words, separating those who belonged from those who were merely tolerated. To stand in this room was to walk a tightrope of appearances, where pride disguised itself as elegance, and every smile was sharpened into a blade. She stood among them with the quiet grace of someone who knew how to vanish in plain sight. Success clung to her like a faint perfume, real but never flaunted. Her wealth was hard-earned, her influence discreet, and because she chose silence over spectacle, she remained invisible to the eyes that only recognized power when it was announced. They mistook her composure for insignificance, her modesty for weakness. And in their blindness, they underestimated her. That was their first mistake. At the center of it all, he thrived. The groom's cousin, son of privilege, heir to a family name carried like a crown. His presence commanded attention not because of worth, but because he demanded it. Arrogance had carved itself into his posture, and humiliation was his preferred sport. He fed on the unease of others, each insult he delivered carefully measured to draw laughter from those too timid to challenge him. Tonight, he had found his target in her, the quiet figure he had always considered beneath the chandeliers, glow. It began with a smile, polished and cold, the kind that recalled 100 smaller cruelties left unsaid. Old wounds resurfaced in his words, casual dismissals from years past now dressed as jokes. He spoke with the practiced ease of someone, certain no one would interrupt, certain his pedigree excused every cruelty. To the crowd, it was entertainment. To her, it was a reminder that the world still saw her as an outsider, no matter what she had built. The sting was real, but it was not paralyzing. It was clarifying. Where another might have faltered, she remained still. Her calm was not surrender. It was calculation. Like a chess player watching her opponent parade his pieces across the board, she absorbed every strike without flinching. Each barb was another move, another opportunity, another reminder of how predictable he had always been. Around her, laughter rose, some faces turned away in discomfort, but she did not bend. Instead, she began to measure her countermove, not for tonight, but for the moment that would matter most. Patience, she had learned, was the sharpest weapon. Long ago, she had seen storms burn themselves out, leaving behind only the wreckage they created. Timing was everything. To strike too soon was to risk becoming what she despised. So she let his storm rage, his pride inflate, his voice grow louder. She became the eye of it, silent and unshaken, storing every detail with the discipline of someone who knew that silence often did more damage than noise. As the chandeliers cast their golden light, she lifted her eyes to meet his, holding his gaze just long enough for him to falter before masking it with another laugh. Beneath her composed exterior, a promise had already been written. Tonight's laughter would not last. The stage he believed was his would one day turn into his undoing, and when it did, his arrogance would become the very rope that tightened around him. She did not need to announce her vow. It was carved into the stillness of her resolve. What had begun as humiliation was already transforming into strategy, and his downfall had quietly begun beneath the glow of silk and shadows. His words lingered long after the laughter faded, replaying in her mind not as pain, but as clarity. They were more than an insult. They were a confession. In every syllable she heard the truth of who he was. A man who believed power gave him the right to diminish others. Where once she might have allowed those words to pierce her, now she studied them as carefully as one studies the first spark that precedes a fire. It was not the humiliation she carried home, but the certainty that his arrogance had just unlocked the door to his undoing. The more she watched him, the more cracks began to show in the golden facade he wore so proudly. Behind the expensive suits and calculated charm, she noticed the frantic edge in his laughter, the way his eyes darted when conversations turned to business. What others saw as wealth and confidence, she recognized as desperation stitched together with arrogance. The shine was there, but beneath it, rot was spreading, and he was too blind to notice. Whispers reached her in fragments, an unpaid debt here, a questionable deal there. She followed them quietly, piecing together the ledgers and lies that kept his empire standing. Fraud hid in polished contracts, manipulation slipped through his dealings, and corruption trailed in his shadow. To the world, he was untouchable, but to her, the illusion had already begun to unravel. Each discovery sharpened her resolve, each secret another stone for the foundation of his downfall. As she uncovered the present, the past resurfaced, uninvited but unavoidable. She remembered the rumors he spread, the whispers that had poisoned her reputation when she was at her most vulnerable. She recalled how he turned wealth into a weapon, pushing doors shut in her face, ensuring she remained on the outside while he basked within gilded halls. Every memory returned not as a wound but as fuel, reminding her that this was no single insult to avenge. It was years of betrayal demanding justice. He, of course, noticed none of this. Why would he? In his mind, she had always been powerless. Convinced of his superiority, he flaunted his riches without caution, parading himself before those who envied him and mocking those he deemed beneath him. His arrogance was not just a flaw, it was a blindfold, keeping him from realizing that while he looked down on her, she was already rising. While he drowned himself in excess, she became the invisible hand moving pieces into place. Documents were collected, testimonies whispered in confidence, patterns of deceit mapped out with cold precision. She left no trace of her intent, no ripple of suspicion to disturb his delusions. Each proof was a blade sharpened in silence, waiting for the moment when the cut would be deepest. But evidence alone was not enough. She needed allies, voices stronger together than apart. Behind closed doors, she formed quiet alliances, each built carefully, each sealed with trust and mutual purpose. Former victims of his cruelty, silent observers of his corruption, even those within his circle who had grown weary of his tyranny. They all found in her the strength to do what they could not do alone. Piece by piece, she wove a network, invisible, to him yet strong enough to collapse the walls he thought unbreakable. Her patience made the suspense heavier. While he laughed and basked in the glow of admiration, she watched, calm and deliberate, knowing the snare was already tightening. He did not see the danger beneath his feet, did not notice how the ground shifted with every careless step. And she did not rush, for timing was everything. One move too soon would dull the blade, The right moment would end him entirely. It was then, in his arrogance, that he struck again. His laughter rang across the room as he called her cheap, trash, a line meant to entertain his crowd. But this time, her silence was not the silence of restraint. It was the silence of fire smoldering beneath gilded floors. He never saw the spark he had kindled, never felt the heat rising under the empire he built. By the time he realized the flames were his own making, it would already be too late. He stood at the center of the room, words spilling from his lips with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed only to witness his greatness. Laughter followed his every boast, directed at those he deemed lesser, and each insult sharpened the edges of his ego. Every gesture was designed to dominate, every story exaggerated to highlight his superiority. Yet in his arrogance, he left cracks, tiny, almost imperceptible, but to her they were openings, invisible to the crowd but glaring in clarity. Tonight, his pride betrayed him. Amid the flow of name-dropping and exaggerated achievements, a careless slip escaped, a misfiled document, a message sent to the wrong recipient, a forged signature that betrayed his meticulous veneer. The room remained unaware, distracted by the drama of his performance, but she noticed. Each careless word, each exposed flaw, was a thread she could pull, a key to unraveling the man who believed himself untouchable. She watched quietly, cataloging every mistake. The empire he flaunted, built on bluster and intimidation, revealed itself to be fragile, its foundation weakened by greed and deceit. What others mistook for invulnerability, she saw as vulnerability dressed in gold. The first thread of his downfall was hers to tug, and she savored the slow anticipation of the unraveling yet to come. She allowed the whispers to flow into the room like a faint wind, light enough to be dismissed, but sharp enough to reach the right ears. A nudge here, a quiet insinuation there, enough to bait him without revealing her hand. He responded with overconfidence, unaware that every boast, every act of dominance, only tightened the web around him. The trap had been set, and he stepped deeper into it willingly. He never looked her way, never considered that the quiet figure in the corner could be orchestrating the stage he so proudly occupied. To him, she was insignificant, a shadow at the edges of his world. But her absence from his attention was her greatest advantage. She could manipulate the pieces freely while he continued to strut and preen, blind to the hunter who had already circled him. Foundations began to crumble quietly beneath him. Allies who once admired his bravado now whispered behind closed doors. Contracts he had forged with deceit were being questioned, and investors who once bowed to his presence paused to reconsider. What had seemed unshakable, the wealth, the reputation, the control, was now wobbling, and he remained oblivious, his laughter louder, his arrogance more flamboyant, as if daring fate to intervene. Even as the audience sensed a shift, he continued to play the confident predator, strutting through the room as though nothing could touch him. Smug smiles masked the creeping panic beneath his surface, the cornered wolf still laughing even as the hunters closed in. Those who knew better began to see the threads of his undoing, while he remained self-absorbed, certain of his superiority, blind to the inevitability pressing from every direction. Unaware that the snare had already caught him, he had already submitted to the force that would bring him down. Every boast, every careless move had brought him to this moment. Her calm was absolute patience perfected into precision. The stage was set, the pieces aligned, and all that remained was for her to press down, to let the weight of inevitability complete what years of careful planning had begun. His knees were ready to break. She only needed to apply the final, measured pressure to see the empire of arrogance crumble entirely. The gala unfolded like a stage, every glittering detail meticulously arranged, but the real performance was invisible to the untrained eye. She moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. each gesture measured, each smile hiding the quiet storm she carried. Every table, every seating choice, every subtle placement of conversations had been considered, all designed to ensure that the night would reveal what had been hidden for too long. She was no longer an observer. She was the architect, and the curtain was ready to rise. The first evidence appeared as if by fate, though it had been guided carefully into her hands. Hidden contracts, recordings of clandestine conversations, financial statements altered to reveal the truth. They were fragments of a life built on deceit, now assembled into a damning whole. One by one, they were positioned to strike with precision, impossible to deny, impossible to ignore. Each piece told a story he had spent years trying to hide, and each revelation landed with the weight of inevitability. As the proofs emerged, whispers grew into undeniable voices. Colleagues, former allies, and witnesses who had once been silenced stepped forward, their words weaving a tapestry of his misdeeds. Lies that had seemed invincible began to unravel under the combined force of truth. Each account chipped away at the fortress of arrogance he had built, exposing the careful manipulations and betrayals he had relied upon to maintain control. He tried to mask the first flickers of doubt with laughter, with confident denials, but the sound rang hollow against the mounting evidence. Every claim he made was met with contradiction too precise to dispute, every boast countered with proof that cut through the bravado. For the first time, the confidence that had always defined him faltered, revealing the vulnerability he had never imagined others could see. The collapse began subtly at first, unnoticed by those who hadn't been watching closely, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Friends distanced themselves, colleagues avoided his gaze, family members whispered in corridors once filled with loyalty. The empire of pride he had curated so carefully was cracking, and the public humiliation he had once wielded against others now returned to claim him. He sank visibly to his knees, a desperate plea escaping lips that had so often mocked. Every word of forgiveness, every appeal to pity, fell flat. There was no rescue from the ruin he had brought upon himself, no shield left strong enough to hold against the weight of his exposed arrogance. He was a man stripped bare, powerless beneath the weight of truths he had spent years denying. Throughout it all, she stood apart, a silent observer of justice meticulously delivered. Her composure never wavered, and her presence reminded those watching that this was not chaos, but the calculated result of patience, intellect, and relentless strategy. She felt no need to speak, no need to gloat. The moment itself carried the poetry of retribution she had long envisioned. When the night ended, the man who had once mocked, belittled, and humiliated her was left exposed, diminished in ways words could not fully capture, and she walked away, quiet in her power, her revenge complete not through spectacle, but through the undeniable, intelligent unraveling of deceit. Success had become her voice, strategy her shield, and patience her crown, leaving the world to witness the final, satisfying triumph of someone who had waited long enough to let justice unfold exactly as it should. His kingdom of pride and carefully curated influence began to collapse with the inevitability of a long-neglected dam giving way. Deals he had once flaunted as triumphs crumbled under scrutiny. Partners withdrew their support, and the wealth that had seemed untouchable evaporated like mist under a rising sun. The social circles that had once hung on his every boast now turned their backs, leaving a hollow echo where applause and admiration had thrived. He was unmoored, exposed, and powerless, the architect of his own ruin. The laughter and admiration that had once followed him like a shadow vanished, replaced by silence and avoidance. Invitations went unanswered, messages were left unopened, and those who had once smiled at his every word now crossed the street or whispered behind closed doors. The walls of influence that had insulated him from accountability dissolved, revealing a man alone with the weight of his arrogance. Every glance that once reinforced his dominance now felt like a silent indictment, each absence a reminder of the empire he had lost. Meanwhile, she moved through this shifting landscape with quiet precision. Composed and poised, she watched as the world corrected itself around her, her presence a calm counterpoint to the chaos he had created. Her satisfaction did not come in shrill triumph or mocking words, but in the serene knowledge that the forces of patience, strategy, and intelligence had been enough to dismantle what cruelty and pride had built. She thrived not in spectacle, but in the invisible confirmation that her careful planning had reached its inevitable conclusion. Her victories were spoken not in proclamations, but in results. Achievements that had once seemed distant now became living proof of her competence and foresight. Projects she had nurtured in silence flourished, her reputation solidified by merit rather than fear or intimidation. The world had begun to see her not as a participant in his games, but as a figure whose calm persistence outweighed any arrogance he had wielded. Success itself became her statement, a declaration that her strategy had been both patient and relentless, and more powerful than any public humiliation could ever be. In the quiet that followed, the lessons of the long struggle became clear. The subtle art of patience, the weight of intelligence over cruelty, and the disciplined application of strategic silence proved mightier than hasty revenge or loud vindication. Every maneuver, every calculated delay, every observation made in shadows had culminated in an outcome far beyond what open confrontation could have achieved. The balance had shifted, quietly but completely, rewarding foresight over impulsive pride. As she reflected, a quiet smile crossed her lips, not of glee, but of acknowledgement. She had never sought to match him in arrogance or to mirror his cruelty. She had always been 10 steps ahead, anticipating every move, planning for every contingency, and allowing the world to unfold exactly as it would. Her revenge had been perfected not in spectacle, but in subtle mastery. In the end, she realized that true power was not in dominance, but in the quiet certainty of being unassailable, always prepared, and always steps ahead of those who had once thought themselves untouchable.